Why do two of Africa's largest countries want to go to war with one another? The story starts in 1929, when Egypt and Britain signed a treaty which gave the Egyptians a lot of control over the upper parts of the Nile. Control of these parts, even though they were outside of Egypt, was important because the country is greatly dependent on the Nile River for its existence. Without the river, all of Egypt's green areas would become desert and the country would look like its neighbors to the east and west. The 1929 treaty with the British stipulated that any water projects up the Nile River would have to gain permission from the Egyptians before going forward. This included things like irrigation projects and dams. At the time, this treaty sort of worked out because the British had control over Sudan and Uganda, the two other Nile River countries, meaning that ultimately it was really the British who had a say in what went on upstream, and protecting Egypt's existence seemed to be in their interest as an empire. Of course, however, there was one country not under British control, whose waters Egypt supposedly had control over. The British generally left Ethiopia out of the treaty and didn't really take it into account. This is despite the fact that almost 80% of the Nile River, which goes through Sudan and into Egypt, originates in Ethiopia. This would naturally cause problems further down the line. In 1959, another Nile Treaty was created, this time between Egypt, acting with Syria as the United Arab Republic, and newly independent Sudan. Nasser divided the Nile River up between himself and the Sudanese, allowing for the creation of dams throughout the two countries. Uganda, then still under British control however, was left out of the deal, as was Ethiopia. This deal would clearly cause an issue however. Egypt and Sudan, despite splitting up the Nile River's waters between themselves, would have to rely on Ethiopia and Uganda, who actually own the sources of the Nile, and could theoretically reduce Egypt and Sudan's water intake by placing a dam or irrigating the river. Nonetheless, the 1959 treaty between the United Arab Republic and Sudan continued as it was seen as the most comprehensive and in-depth water-sharing agreement for the Nile. It allowed Gamal Abdel Nasser to build the Aswan High Dam, and made it so that any large-scale activity in the Upper Nile had to be approved by Egypt first before moving forward. This status quo was maintained for decades, perhaps because Ethiopia and Uganda did not rely on the Nile as much as Egypt and Sudan, and because they had their own internal political issues that prevented national development. Fast forward to 2011, Sudan splits in two, Egypt is undergoing a revolution, and Ethiopia becomes one of the fastest developing countries in Africa. For once in a long time, Ethiopia was in a position to take advantage of its resources and become a strong nation, being a target for a high amount of foreign investment. It also comes at a time when China, becoming a richer nation, is putting billions of dollars into African infrastructure projects. One of these projects would be the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The dam's purpose was to take charge of Ethiopia's destiny by harnessing the power of the world's longest river and provide electricity, power, and jobs to tens of millions of Ethiopians. Its purpose is in the name, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. As in, this is the dam that will give Ethiopia its grand renaissance. The dam is expected to generate electricity for much of the nation, and this point is particularly important because only about 45% of Ethiopians have access to electricity. That is very low for a country who also has a population of over 120 million people. Moreover, it is mainly urban areas that have access to this electricity, with rural areas lagging behind severely. It goes without saying how difficult it is to build a large economy when half the country doesn't have electricity. Looking at other statistics, lack of electricity may also be one reason for the country's relative poverty. Despite being the second largest African country by population, it is fifth in terms of nominal GDP. Ethiopia's lower GDP theoretically could be increased if more electricity was generated for the half of the country that doesn't have it, because then that half of the country would be able to work and produce value, and thereby increase the GDP. Regardless, the project hit an obvious controversy, which is that Ethiopia technically needed the permission of Egypt to build this project according to the 1929 and 1959 Nile agreements Egypt signed with Britain and Sudan respectively. In 2011, Ethiopia launched the project anyway, saying that it was a simple case of Ethiopian sovereignty. Egypt, as expected, rejected this line of reasoning, and the question came up of what they could do about it. What happened upstream the Nile did affect Egypt, and the concern was that if the dam was built, it may possibly reduce the flow of water downstream. This was a serious concern for two reasons. Firstly is how populated the country is, and secondly is how reliant that population is on one single water source. Over 110 million people live in Egypt today, which is massive for a desert country. In terms of Arab countries, who are mostly desert, the next most populous nations are Sudan, Algeria, and Iraq, with roughly 50 and 46 million people living in them respectively. These 110 million people also live primarily along the Nile River, and rely on it for their survival. Egypt essentially has double the population of these countries despite having a similar level to, if not lower, access to water. That being said, a reduction in the inflow of water which originated in Ethiopia would be a clear threat to these 100 million people, and soon the question arose for what was to be done about it. Then President Mohamed Morsi talked with the international panel of experts about what options they had to respond to Ethiopia. Some political leaders suggested that they destroy the dam, or that they support anti-government rebels in Ethiopia. What Morsi didn't know, however, was that they were saying this on live television in front of the whole world. Ethiopia, as expected, demanded an explanation, but the tensions died down soon after. Egypt nonetheless would continue its opposition to the dam primarily on the basis of its existence, and Ethiopia would oppose that by highlighting its right to sovereignty. In between the two, however, was a surprisingly neutral country, Sudan. Although the Sudanese did rely on the Nile for much of their water, especially after losing the greener areas of South Sudan in 2011, and although they did agree with the 1959 agreement with Egypt that all projects in the Upper Nile had to be approved by the government in Cairo, the Sudanese weren't entirely on Egypt's side. In 2012, after meeting with the ministers of water of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, the Sudanese president Omar Bashir stated that he approved of the dam. This might be because completion of the dam would do a few things. It would ease flooding in Sudan's surrounding region, would allow easier irrigation for Sudan, and it would give Sudan cheaper energy. The dam is very close to the Sudanese border, and whatever benefits Ethiopia sees from the dam, most likely Sudan will too. At the same time, however, Sudan has several concerns, one of which are the unknown environmental consequences of the dam which Sudan, being so close to the dam, would certainly face. The country already suffers from flooding, and a man-made one would be even worse. The biggest concern Sudan has, however, is that if Egypt were to strike Ethiopia to destroy the dam and spark a conflict between the two, that war would probably be fought on Sudanese territory, and the jets which would attack Ethiopia would probably fly over Sudanese airspace. This placed Sudan in a great position to mediate between the governments in Cairo and Addis Ababa, especially as the successful mediation would improve its reputation globally. They had some success. In 2015, for example, the three countries signed the Declaration of Principles in Khartoum, which included Ethiopia completing an analysis of the environmental and social impacts of the dam's construction. The Ethiopians later backed out of doing this, however. Egypt also insisted that the dam be filled slowly. However, Ethiopia wants it to be completed faster in order to produce more energy. In this regard, Sudan does have an interest in filling the dam up slowly and undergoing environmental studies, because the Ethiopian dam sits only a few kilometers away from the Sudanese border. This means that if there are any environmental issues related to the project, Sudan, more than Ethiopia, will have to bear the brunt of the damage. This is in addition to the fact that, like Egypt, Sudan is also reliant on the Nile for its water, and a reduction in the amount of water going downstream would be just as costly. Ethiopia, however, rejected the environmental studies and remained adamant on the dam being filled up quickly. For them, it was an issue of national development because filling up the dam too slowly may not generate enough energy to benefit the country as mentioned previously. The Sudanese mediations led nowhere, and tensions became worse between Egypt and Ethiopia. The United States tried its hand at mediating between the two, but that eventually led to Ethiopia accusing America and the World Bank of siding with Egypt. All the while, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed remained firm on Ethiopia's interests, and Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi remained firm in keeping all options open, including potentially striking the dam. For Ethiopia, the dam would very much help its development as one of the strongest African countries, but for Egypt, the dam is a threat to its existence as one of the African countries. That begs the question then, if a strike on the dam would be feasible. While Egypt does have the larger military and would likely be capable of destroying the dam which sits just a few kilometers from the Sudanese border, destruction of the dam would likely cause flooding in much of the surrounding region, and by surrounding region I mean Sudan, who is already undergoing a violent and deadly civil war. Such a strike would possibly be successful in protecting Egypt's water rights, but may come at the cost of Egypt's reputation in the short term, especially for many Sudanese. If you found this video helpful, you may find this other video talking about Egypt and Libya's forgotten war to be useful. If you're not into that, you may find this other video talking about why Iran hates Egypt to be interesting. If this is your first time on the channel and you want a credible source of information on Egyptian politics, Middle Eastern politics, or global politics in general, you can subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on anything. I put all scholarly and non-scholarly sources cited APA style in the description below. Thank you for watching.